Sell by Sunday, or we bury you next to him. 3 days gun drawn, 5 riders ringing a lone widow's porch, and it would change everything the moment those men learned the tired, dusk-gray drifter riding toward her gate from the south had once been the most feared name west of the Brazos, though no one in that yard would ever see the reckoning coming until it was already on top of them. Friends, this is the story of Della Whitlock of the Guadalupe country in the summer of 1884 in the Texas Hill Country, and of a debt one quiet man had buried so deep he thought even God had lost the address, Tet. If you ride with stories like this, tap that subscribe button now and stay with me clear to the end, because before this tale is done, a crooked land agent with china plates and clean hands is going to learn exactly what he woke up. Pour something warm, settle in. Now, let's go back. Back to the morning they lowered Tom Whitlock into Red Hill country clay, and forward to the porch 3 days before Sunday, when 5 armed men sat their horses in Della's yard. The hill country of Texas in 1884 did not care much for sentiment. It was limestone and cedar and 100 dry creek beds that only remembered they were creeks twice a year. In the spring melt and the autumn storms, and in between a man lived or died by the wells he dug and the luck he hadn't spent yet. Tom Whitlock had dug good wells. He'd homesteaded 310 acres of scrub and grass along Cypress Creek with his own 2 hands, married a Georgia girl named Della who'd come west, following an uncle who died of fever before she ever found him. And for 4 years, Tom wasn't a large man. He had a laugh that came easy, a way of tilting his hat back when he was pleased with himself, which was often because he was pleased easily and grateful for small things, the rain, the harvest, his wife's cooking, which by his own frequent admission was only fair. She threw a dish towel at him for that once in front of company, and he laughed so hard he had to sit down, and that was their marriage in miniature, small and unremarkable and entirely theirs. It was not a grand love. It was a good one, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind you only notice the size of once it's gone. What Tom Whitlock did not know, because he had never thought to look, was that the survey line on his southern boundary ran directly across a vein of good, cool artesian water that fed 3 creeks in a dry county, and that a man named Horace Pemberton, land agent for the Guadalupe Cattle and Land Company, had been quietly buying up every claim within 6 miles of that water for 2 years, under 6 different names. Tom's claim was the last piece. Without it, Pemberton's investors in Austin and Points East could not consolidate the grazing rights they needed to lease the whole valley to a single combine at 4 times what any of it was worth broken up into small holdings. Pemberton had made Tom 2 offers over the winter, each one politely worded, each one a little higher than the last, and Tom had turned both down without much thought, the way a man turns down a bad trade at a horse auction, because Tom Whitlock did not yet understand that some offers dressed up nicely enough are not offers at all. On a Tuesday in June, Tom rode out to check a fence line on the East 40 and did not come home. They found him the next morning at the bottom of a limestone draw, his horse grazing nearby untroubled, and the story that came back to Della, delivered by a soft-spoken foreman named Dutch Kessler, with his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder. Della looked at her husband's hands when they brought him home. Tom's hands were calloused and sure, a horseman's hands, with an old scar along the left thumb from a barbed wire cut 2 summers back that he liked to show off at church socials as evidence of his frontier toughness. She had watched that man ride green colts that would have put lesser riders in the dirt inside of a minute. Tom Whitlock did not get thrown by a spooked horse on a trail he'd ridden 400 times, and she knew it the way a wife knows the sound of her own husband's step on a porch board without needing to think about how she knew. But she kept that knowledge behind her teeth, gave Dutch Kessler nothing but a nod and a closed door, because a young widow, alone on good water, with nothing but a suspicion in her chest, had learned, fast, that suspicion spoken aloud in the wrong company could get a person buried right alongside their grief. She buried her husband with the help of her nearest neighbor, a widow herself, a stout, no-nonsense woman named Odessa Pratt, who lived 2 miles down creek. Odessa arrived with a shovel in one hand and a pot of beans in the other, worked the whole first hour in silence, and only broke that silence once the grave was near finished, allowing that she'd buried 2 husbands and a brother in this country. It was, Della would think later, exactly the right thing to say, and exactly the right amount of comfort, no more, no less. Odessa stayed 2 extra days after that, sleeping on a cot in the front room, though she'd never once been invited to, and it wasn't until the second morning, over coffee neither of them had much appetite for, that she finally admitted the real reason she hadn't gone home. Her own late husband had sold water access to 3 of the small outfits along the strip for years, cheap and fair, the same way Tom had, and 6 months before he died of a heart seizure out in the yard. Horace Pemberton's man Colfax had ridden out twice to discuss. Odessa had never once put those 2 facts together out loud, not to the sheriff, not to her own grown children, but she put them together now, sitting at Della's table, and the 2 widows looked at each other a long moment with the particular understanding of women who have both. On the 3rd day after the funeral, 5 riders came up the road from the direction of Pemberton's land office in the town of Comfort, and Della, watching them from the kitchen window with flowers still on her hands, understood before a single word passed between them that these men had not ridden 2 hours in the June heat to pay their respects. Horace Pemberton himself never rode out to a widow's porch. That was not how a man like Pemberton did business. And it's worth understanding the shape of him before you understand the shape of what he sent instead. He was 54 years old, narrow through the shoulders, precise in his dress, even in July, heat, transplant from Charleston by way of a failed cotton fortune, and he had discovered in Texas. Provided he was willing, on the rare occasion business required it, to hire the guns anyway. He ate his supper off bone china shipped up from New Orleans. He read from a leather Bible each Sunday morning to whichever of his men happened to be present, in a voice that never rose and never wavered, the very same measured voice he used to explain to a struggling rancher why his loan had come due 6 weeks early. He owned the land office outright, held a controlling share of the Comfort Bank, and carried enough paper on enough small operations across 3 counties that very few men in that country would say his name above a murmur, and fewer still would say it to his face. What Pemberton wanted from Della Whitlock was not sentiment, and it was not in truth even the water itself. He wanted the deed clear and signed before a territorial land commissioner arrived from Austin at the end of the month to review contested claims in the district, because buried in that review, if any careful man thought to ask the right questions of the right neighbors. Dat proof that 6 different settlers who'd filed claims around the valley these past 2 years did not exist, never had. Papermen, invented whole by Horace Pemberton, to slip past a federal limit on how much land any one company could patent. Tom Whitlock, in the last months of his life, had started asking exactly those questions. The man Pemberton sent to carry out his instructions was his range boss, a lean, unhurried rider named Wade Colfax, 30-some years old, soft-voiced, clean-shaven in a country where most men wore 3 weeks of beard without apology, which gave him a boyish look that had fooled more than one fool into thinking him harmless. Colfax kept a taste for good whiskey, but indulged it only after the day's business was concluded, never before, a discipline that made him more dangerous, not less. He rode that summer with 4 men, and each of them carried his own particular rot. Big, slow-moving Ezra Combs owed gambling debts he could never quite outrun, and would take any job going so long as it paid before Friday. Young Rufus Tate mistook cruelty for toughness, had a habit of hurting things smaller than himself when nobody watched too closely, dogs mostly. And once, by local account, a stable boy in Kerrville left with a broken arm over a dice game gone sideways. Squat, nervous Otto Speer drank from sunup and stayed on Colfax's payroll for one gift only, a genuine talent for tracking a man across bare rock, wasted entirely on a small and frightened soul. And the 5th, barely 20, was a boy named Cyrus Boyle, who still told himself he rode for a legitimate cattle outfit and that the rough business was the exception rather than the rule. A comfortable lie Colfax found useful, never once bothered to correct. A man could learn a great deal about the Hollis crew, as the townsfolk of Comfort had taken to calling them after the failed cattle spread. Most of them had once worked before Pemberton bought their loyalty outright just by watching how each spent an evening in town. Ezra Combs lost $11 at faro on the Thursday before the funeral and borrowed 9 more from Colfax to keep playing. A debt Colfax noted down without comment and would collect on later, in ways that had nothing to do with money. Rufus Tate got into it with a stable dog behind the Comfort livery that same week, kicked the animal hard enough that the owner came out swinging a pitchfork, and Rufus laughed the whole retreat back to the saloon like it was the finest joke he'd heard all month. Otto Speer drank a full bottle of rye alone at the bar and wept, briefly and without explanation, before 3 more glasses steadied him back into his usual sullen quiet, and nobody in the room asked why, because everybody in Comfort had long since learned not to ask Otto Speer anything at all. Young Cyrus Boyle sat apart from the other 4 that same night, nursing a single beer, watching his companions with an expression somewhere between shame and the particular loneliness of a young man who suspects he has fallen in with the wrong outfit. These 5 sat their horses in Della Whitlock's yard on the 3rd day after her husband's funeral. Colfax dismounted, alone removed his hat with an almost courtly gesture, and delivered his message in that soft, unhurried voice that Mr. Dack. Pemberton wished to make one final generous offer for the deed to the Whitlock claim, $400, more than fair given the circumstances. Della stood in her doorway, flowers still on her hands from a bread she hadn't finished. Her husband was 3 days in the ground, plain and simple, and she hadn't had the chance yet to think of anything at all, let alone selling the only thing he'd left her. Colfax understood entirely, ma'am, entirely, but patience, like anything else, had its season, and the land commissioner would be in Comfort by month's end, and it would be a great deal simpler for everyone, himself included, if matters were settled before then. Hat back on, he allowed that the hill country was a hard place for a woman alone, that accidents befell lone travelers and lone homesteads both, that he'd hate for anything further to happen to a young widow with no one to look after her interests. Then he rode off with his 4 men trailing, and somewhere behind him Rufus Tate laughed at a joke Della did not hear, and did not need to. It was 2 evenings later, in the deep gold light just before dark, that a rider came up the north track alone, sitting a gray horse that looked as trail-worn as the man on it. He stopped at Della's gate without announcing himself. Della came to the door with Tom's old shotgun already in her hands and did not lower it. The man was maybe 44, tall in the saddle, but carrying himself like someone who'd spent a long time trying to take up less room than he actually did. A week's growth of beard, a plain gray coat gone the color of the road, eyes the flat, careful color of creekstone in winter. "My name's Silas Whitlock, ma'am. Tom was my brother." Della had known Tom, had a brother somewhere out past the frontier, mentioned rarely and always with a small pause before the name, the way a person mentions a room in the house they don't go into anymore. She had pictured someone who resembled Tom. This man did not resemble Tom, not in the face and not in the stillness of him, and she understood without being told that whatever had put that stillness into a man had cost a great deal more than 4 years of hill country weather. He'd gotten word of his brother's death 3 weeks late, a letter forwarded twice, and had ridden a long way to arrive too late for the funeral, and just in time, though he didn't know it yet, for everything else. He requested only a night in the barn, nothing more, and Della, exhausted past the point of caution, granted it, mostly because something in those flat gray eyes made plain this was not a man who needed watching so much as a man who was already watching everything himself. In the morning he was mending a fence rail unbidden. That evening, over a supper she hadn't expected to share with anyone, Della finally spoke the thing she'd shared with no living soul. They killed him. Silas didn't look surprised, didn't reach for comfort or argument either one, just set down his fork and let her keep talking, and when she finished he allowed, quiet, that he'd guessed as much the moment he heard 5 riders had visited a fresh grave. Men who show up 3 days after a funeral with an offer and a deadline both were a breed he'd ridden with before. On the other side of the transaction, a land agent. Pemberton, his man's named Colfax. Silas went quiet a long moment, long enough that the lamp guttered once in a draft. Men like Colfax, too, he knew, and the careful weight in his voice made Della set down her own fork and look at him properly for the first time. Here's a thing about small towns in the hill country in 1884. They forgot faces slowly, and there were still a few old-timers in Comfort who remembered a different name attached to a face like that one. Silas rode into town that second morning the way a man rides in who has done this kind of scouting 100 times before, and has never once forgotten how. He bought tobacco he didn't much want at the mercantile, took his time about it, and let the storekeeper talk, which storekeepers in small towns are generally glad enough to do. He learned, without asking a single direct question, that the Guadalupe Cattle and Land Company had bought out or run off nearly every small claim within 6 miles of Comfort in the last 2 years. A decent reputation, had grown strangely comfortable in his final term, riding a finer horse than his salary ought to allow, and never once looking too hard at any accident that happened to fall near Pemberton's interests. Silas walked the length of the main street twice, slow, cataloging the land office's windows and doors and the stable, where Pemberton's riders kept their mounts, the way another man might read a book he intended to argue with. It was on his second pass, coming out of the White Elm Saloon, having nursed one warm beer for 20 unhurried minutes, that an old freight hauler named Amos Purcell grabbed his sleeve outside the mercantile with the urgency of a man who'd just seen a ghost he'd hoped never to see again. He pulled Silas around the side of the building before anyone else could notice and swore under his breath that he knew that face, had it nailed to his office wall for 2 years running under a different name, Silas Reyes, and a title men in 3 territories had once used instead of a name at all. The Undertaker, out past the Pecos, that's what they'd called him. Silas's expression never changed, which Amos seemed to find more convincing than any denial could have been. Paper never had the whole truth on it, was all Silas offered back. It never does. Amos studied him a moment longer. Aloud he'd heard the man quit. Heard a preacher talked him down off it somewhere in New Mexico. Heard he'd put the guns in a box and never picked them up again. Something like that. And now you're back. Not really a question, that, more a statement Amos needed said aloud, and Silas only looked down the street toward the land office, small and neat with its fresh white paint, offering nothing further. What Amos didn't know, and what came out of Silas that night. Haltingly, in pieces. Sitting by the fire with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup he never once drank from, was the true shape of the name Undertaker. He'd ridden for money in his 20s and 30s, hired out to whoever paid a gun for men who called themselves cattlemen and were sometimes closer kin to the men Della had just met in her own yard. There'd been a job, 11 years back, outside a dying cow town in the Pecos country. An employer he trusted the fool way a young man trusts anyone who pays him well, and on time had sworn a certain rancher's son was a horse thief and a killer, worth calling out in the open street the way the code demanded. Shot the man dead in 4 seconds, flat, clean, by every rule of the trade, and it was only 3 days later, drunk and sick with something he didn't yet have a name for, that the truth surfaced. The dead man had refused to sell his father's water rights to the very employer who'd sent Silas after him, and that refusal, dressed up as horse thieving, had been his only crime. Silas had killed an innocent man over a lie wearing a contract's clothes, and the men who'd paid him only smiled and paid him again, and something in him broke that night that never fully mended afterward. 2 more years he rode on reputation alone, taking fewer jobs, drinking more of the wrong kind of nights, until a circuit preacher at a New Mexico tent revival he'd wandered into more or less by accident looked him dead in the eye during an altar call. "You're carrying a dead man you didn't have to kill," the preacher had said, flat out, "and you'll go on carrying him till you put the gun down for good." That same night, Silas buried his pistols in a strongbox under a cottonwood and swore to God and to the dead man both that he was finished. 12 years he kept that promise. Farmhand, drover, fence rider, never a name twice, never a town long enough to be remembered in it. "Your husband never got the truth of it from me," he admitted quietly, "only that I'd made mistakes and wanted done with that life." He never pressed for more. Tom was kind that way. Della watched the fire a long while before she spoke again. The man's name was Colfax, not the same men who'd wronged him all those years back. And Silas agreed, not the same men, but the very same lie wearing a different collar, somebody paying good money to convince good men that hurting somebody was really just business. He'd made himself a private promise once, that if he ever heard that particular tune played again, he'd walk the other way. Was he walking the other way now? She wanted to know. He held her gaze a long moment across the firelight before answering. Tom was the only person who ever loved him without needing anything explained first. He was done walking away from what was left of his brother. Now, friends, before we go on, I want you to do something for me. If you're riding along with this story, hit that subscribe button right now so you don't lose your place on the trail. And drop me a line down in the comments, tell me what town or city you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I've had folks write in from every corner of this country and a few corners of the world besides, and I read every single one of them. Go on, tell me. Now let's get back to the Guadalupe country, because Della Whitlock just found out exactly what kind of man was sleeping in her barn, and Horace Pemberton is about to find out too. Word travels strangely in small counties, faster than any rider can carry it on his own, and it was only 2 days later that Wade Colfax rode alone up to the Whitlock gate, within the white heat of early afternoon. The way a fence post is present, Colfax studied him a moment with the particular attention of one professional, recognizing another, something crossing his face. Brief, quickly smoothed over. Heard there was a relation staying out here, pleasant as Sunday. Didn't hear the name. Silas Whitlock. Colfax turned the name over like a coin he wasn't sure was real. Related to Tom then. His brother. Colfax's eyes moved over him once, boots to hat, cataloging everything. A careful man catalogs before he decides how dangerous a stranger might be. Mrs. Whitlock's business is her own, he allowed at last, and yours too, I suppose. But I'll tell you plain since you're new to the conversation. Mr. Pemberton's offer stands through Sunday. Don't, and I can't speak for what happens next, because land this valuable draws all manner of unfortunate accident. The word accident came out wrapped in a small private smile, like a man sharing a joke he expected the other fellow to appreciate. Silas didn't smile back. Threatening a widow in her own yard, in front of him. And it wasn't a question either. Colfax's smile thinned. Just relaying a business proposition, friend. Get off her land. Quiet as a man remarking on the weather, and something in the quiet of it made Colfax's horse shift under him, though the man himself hadn't moved an inch. Colfax laughed, short and easy, the laugh of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous man in any yard he stood in. You don't want to start something you can't finish, old man. Finished plenty before you were old enough to carry a gun. Get off her land and tell Pemberton the answer's the same as it was for her husband. No? Colfax's hand hadn't truly moved toward his hip, not really, only shifted a fraction, an old habit more than a decision. And Silas's hand moved a fraction faster, not toward his own holster, but simply into view, resting easy on the porch rail an inch from where his coat fell open over the pistol beneath it. Something about the sheer economy of that motion, the utter lack of hurry in it, made Wade Colfax go very still. He'd shot men who moved slower and looked considerably more nervous than this one did. This man looked like a Sunday afternoon with nowhere particular to be. A long pause stretched out between them, and then Silas drew, quick as falling water, and put a single round through the crown of Colfax's hat, where it sat on his head. Close enough the man felt the wind of it pass. The report cracked off the limestone bluff behind the house and rolled away down the valley in a long dying echo. Colfax's horse shied hard sideways. Colfax himself sat frozen, hat gone off into the dirt, a small clean hole punched through the crown where it lay. Next one's lower. Holstering the pistol as easy as a man swatting a fly off his sleeve. Silas told him plain to go on and let Pemberton know he was dealing with somebody new. Colfax retrieved his hat with hands that weren't quite steady, mounted, rode off at a pace just short of a run, and it would be 3 full days before anyone in Comfort heard the true story. That evening, Della sat across from Silas at the kitchen table, hands folded tight in front of her. He could have killed Colfax outright, she pointed out. Could have, Silas agreed. What happened? Come Sunday, she wanted to know. Sunday they'd come back in numbers most likely, once Pemberton heard his man got sent home bareheaded, and Silas meant to be ready for that. He weighed the question honestly, which she'd come to learn was simply his way. He never offered comfort he didn't believe. Not unless Pemberton himself answered for what he'd built out here. Turned back his hired hands a dozen times over, and a man like that just hires a dozen more. The rot had to come out by the root, or it only grew back somewhere else. Then, what was the root? She pressed. Whatever was worth killing a settled man over, she'd mentioned once that Tom kept careful books. Her breath caught at that, the lockbox, under the floor of the spring house. Tom had told her once if anything ever happened to him, that was the first place to look. They went that same night with a lantern, pried up the loose plank. Tom had shown her only once, months back, in the offhand way. A man mentions something without knowing he's leaving instructions behind. Beneath it sat a small tin box wrapped in oilcloth, and inside, in Tom's careful, patient hand, page after page of notes, dates, names, 6 separate homestead filings around the valley that Tom had quietly worked out, through nothing more than careful watching and a good memory for faces, belonged to men who simply did not exist. Signatures on the county filings that matched no hand Tom had ever seen make its mark at the general store. Supposed cabins Tom had ridden past, and found nothing there but bare, undisturbed ground. Tom Whitlock, mild as milk, endlessly curious, had spent the last summer of his life quietly building a case against Horace Pemberton, and his widow had never once known how much danger that curiosity had put him in. They spent the 2 days before Sunday preparing, and Silas moved through that work the way Della imagined he must once have moved through 100 other dangerous mornings, methodical, unhurried, missing nothing. On the first morning he sent a note to Comfort with a boy who ran errands for Odessa Pratt, addressed not to the sheriff whom he trusted about as far as he could throw a loaded wagon, but to the territorial marshal's office in Fort Griffin, closing a short account of Tom Whitlock's ledger and a request that someone with real authority come look at what Horace Pemberton had built in Comfort County before the Land Commissioner's review made it too late to matter. It was a long shot, and he knew it. 3 days was a wide gap for trouble to fill, but a man who has spent 12 years cleaning up other people's messes learns early that you plant every seed you can afford to plant and worry about the harvest later. Then he walked every foot of the property, the dry wash along the north boundary, the old windmill and stock tank behind the barn, the root cellar dug deep into the hillside that Tom had built for keeping vegetables cool through the summer heat, 4 feet of packed earth and timber over a single low door, and Silas looked at every inch of it the way another man might read a book he intended to argue with before he finished it. The root cellar, he decided, would be Della's second position if the porch and kitchen never became untenable, a hard, dark, defensible box a man would have to come at through one door at a time. He strung a taut line of fence wire low across the wash crossing, where a rider coming fast in the dark wouldn't see it until his horse's legs had already found it. He rigged the old windmill's brake so a single rope pull would send the great wheels screaming and clattering into motion, a sound like the end of the world in the deep quiet of a hill country night, meant to startle horses and scatter nerve in equal measure. He filled 3 lanterns with oil and hung them, unlit, along the barn eaves, wired to drop and shatter and flare bright at a single tug from the porch, enough sudden light to turn a dark yard into a lit stage at the exact moment he chose and not one moment before. He walked Della through each position twice, root cellar, to kitchen window, to porch rail, until she could find any of them blind in the dark, with her hand trailing the wall, because a plan a person has to think about in the moment, he told her. And in the evenings by the fire he taught her to shoot. He set Tom's old Navy Colt in her hands the first night. Heavier than it looked, he allowed. And that was fine, her arms would learn the weight soon enough. Standing behind her left shoulder, he had her aim not at the corner of the wall, but at the very center of it, to think only about the point she wanted to hit and let the gun be nothing more than the thing standing between her hand and that point. Her elbow was too high. Drop it. She dropped it. The hardest part of shooting, by his account, was never the aim. It was the half-second before the shot, when the body braces itself against a bang that hasn't happened yet. And that flinch was what made most people miss from 10 feet away with a gun the size of a Bible. Cure was breath in. Let half of it back out, hold what's left. Then squeeze. Don't ever pull. Squeeze it the way you'd press a finger against something you didn't want to startle. She practiced on an empty chamber against the kitchen wall a dozen times that first night, and by the third night her elbow stayed down on its own. Her breath stayed even without her thinking about it, and the imaginary shot landed where she'd aimed it every single time. "If it comes to it," she promised him on that last evening, setting the Colt down with a steadiness that surprised her more than it seemed to surprise him, "I won't miss." He held her gaze a long moment in the lamplight. "No," he agreed. "I don't believe you will." Sunday itself passed slow and strange, the way any day does when both people living through it know exactly what's coming after dark, and neither one wants to say so out loud too many times. Della spent the morning baking bread she wasn't sure anyone would live to eat, because her hands needed something ordinary to do, and Silas spent it walking the property lines one final time, checking every wire and lantern and rope he'd rigged over the past 2 days, adjusting a windmill brake that didn't need adjusting. The way a man checks a thing he already trusts, simply because checking it is easier than sitting still. In the early afternoon, Odessa Pratt rode up unannounced with a shotgun of her own across her saddle and announced, with the flat finality of a woman who has already made up her mind and doesn't care to argue about it, that she'd be staying the night, and no, she would not be talked out of it, and yes, she knew perfectly well how to use the gun in her hands. Silas looked at her a long moment, decided arguing would cost more time than it saved, and set her up at the kitchen window with a clear line on the yard's eastern approach. They came on Sunday night, as Silas had known they would, and they came with more than 5. Pemberton, informed of a bare-headed Colfax and a mysterious relation with old careful eyes, had not been foolish enough to send his usual 4 men back alone. Colfax rode in that night with Ezra Combs, Rufus Tate, Otto Spear, and young Cyrus Boyle, and behind them 3 more hired hands scraped up from a Kerrville bunkhouse for the occasion, 8 riders total coming up the north track in loose formation under a thin moon, gone confident in their numbers the way men so often are, right up until the moment their numbers stop mattering at all. Silas kept Della inside with the Colt, and strict instructions not to step past the threshold until she heard him call her name, and he took up his own position in the shadow of the old stock tank near the windmill, low and unhurried, watching the riders come the way a man watches weather he's already prepared himself for. The lead riders hit the wire at the wash crossing at a hard trot, and the sound was immediate and ugly, iron catching fetlock, a horse screaming and going down hard. Ezra Combs, who'd been riding point on account of the debts he owed Colfax and the little say he had in the matter, went over his mount's neck into the rocks and didn't rise quickly. The rider beside him, one of the Kerrville hands, spun out wide in a panic and nearly rode down Otto's spear, and in that confusion Silas pulled the windmill line. The great wheel above the stock tank shrieked into motion, iron blades clattering and groaning in the dark like some vast dying animal, and horses already rattled by the wash came fully undone, rearing and wheeling across the yard. That's far enough, not loud, though the night carried it clean across the whole yard the way it had carried it across the wash days before. Anybody wanting to ride home tonight best do it now. Rufus Tate was the only one fool enough to go for his pistol in all that chaos, and Silas put a single shot through the meat of his shoulder before the gun had fully cleared leather, a clean wound, ugly and painful, and a long way from fatal, and Rufus went down cursing in the dirt while his horse bolted off without him. The Kerrville hands, hired for a day's wage and no particular loyalty beyond it, took one look at a screaming windmill and a bleeding companion and rode hard for the road without waiting to be asked a second time. Young Cyrus Boyle sat frozen on his horse in the middle of the yard, hands well away from his gun, looking exactly like a boy who just understood for the first time precisely what kind of outfit he'd signed on with. Not unkindly, that. Whatever they'd promised him this job was, it plainly wasn't. Cyrus went and didn't look back, and would later prove the only one of Pemberton's riders to give the true story around comfort without a single embellishment, a fact that would matter a great deal more than he ever came to know. That left only Colfax and Otto's spear, and Spear, drunk as ever even at midnight, had enough animal instinct left in him to know a losing hand when the cards fell that way. Leaving Colfax alone in the yard under the flickering half-light of the lantern Silas had dropped and lit along the barn eaves, Colfax sat his horse very still, looking toward the shadow by the stock tank. "You're the undertaker, not a question either." "That was," came the answer. Silas, stepping into the lantern light at last, pistol steady and unhurried at his side. "Trying real hard not to be." "Get down off that horse, Colfax, ride to comfort, and give the marshal there everything Horace Pemberton's had him doing these past 2 years. That, or stay and finish this the way some part of him clearly still wanted to, and it would end the same either way, only faster if he stayed impatient about it. Colfax's hand hovered near his hip a long moment, weighing the flat, unhurried stillness of the man across the yard against every violent job he'd walked away from whole in 6 years of this work. And something in that particular stillness made plain this calculation wouldn't favor him no matter how he ran the numbers. He lowered his hand slowly. Pemberton would just hire somebody else. Maybe, Silas allowed, but it wouldn't be him, and it wouldn't be tonight, and that was as much peace as either one of them would get to have right now ride. Colfax rode, and for one brief, unguarded moment, it seemed the night had ended cleaner than such nights usually do. Warning shots and a scattered gang, and nobody buried in the dark after all. But Della, inside the house, had heard the retreat of hooves and against every instruction Silas had given her, moved toward the window to see it for herself, and it was in that unguarded second that a side door she hadn't thought to bar swung inward behind her. Horace Pemberton, it turned out, trusted no hired man to finish delicate business on his behalf, and had ridden out separately, alone, arriving late and quiet from the eastern track. He had Della by the wrist before she fully understood. He was even in the room, a small pistol of his own pressed just beneath her ribs, his other hand closing over her mouth, walking her backward toward the open door with the soft, patient calm of a man closing out a difficult negotiation. "Mr. Whitlock," he called into the yard. In that same measured Bible-reading voice there was still a great deal to discuss, and he'd very much prefer to discuss it without further gunplay, if the man out there would be so kind as to lower his weapon and step where his hands could be seen. Silas stood very still in the yard, pistol lowering by inches, his eyes finding Della's over Pemberton's shoulder, and what he saw there was not fear. Her eyes above the hand clamped over her mouth stayed perfectly steady, and her right hand, hidden in the folds of her skirt where Pemberton couldn't see it, already held Tom's Navy Colt, because Silas had pressed it into her palm 2 nights before against exactly this kind of possibility, with strict instruction to keep it on her always, day and night. Until this whole business was finished. 3 ways this goes, Pemberton. Silas kept his voice level, kept the man's eyes fixed on his own face and nowhere else. Let her go, and that's the only path that ends with him alive by sunup. Use that pistol, and he's dead before he clears a second shot. Or keep standing there working out some 4th option that plainly doesn't exist. Pemberton's eyes flicked just slightly toward Della's face, searching it for the fear he'd counted on to keep her still and pliant, and found instead a calm he didn't understand and didn't have time left to solve, because in that half-second of miscalculation, and fired once, clean, through the meat of Pemberton's forearm where it crossed her body, his pistol dropped into the dirt of the doorway. He staggered back with a cry, more of shock than of pain, and Silas closed the distance in 3 long strides and had the man face down in the yard with his good arm wrenched up behind him, before Horace Pemberton fully understood that the negotiation had ended entirely without his consent. The territorial marshal rode in from Fort Griffin 2 days after the letter Silas had sent, sooner than any reasonable man had a right to expect, on account of a young deputy who happened to be passing through Comfort already on unrelated business, and recognized trouble brewing the moment he heard Pemberton's name spoken with that particular careful quiet. Townsfolk reserved for men they're afraid of. His name was Marshal Tobias Renfro, a broad, weathered man of about 60 who had spent 30 years enforcing law across 3 different territories, and had developed in that time an unshakable dislike for well-dressed men who quoted scripture at breakfast. He arrived at the Whitlock place the same gray morning Pemberton was still nursing his bandaged forearm in a spare room under Della's watch, having refused, out of some stubborn remaining pride, to be taken into Comfort until a lawyer could be arranged. Renfro read Tom Whitlock's ledger cover to cover at the kitchen table in near total silence, and when he finished, he set it down carefully, as a man sets down something he understands to be worth more than its weight in paper, and said that he had seen this exact trick work 3 times before in 3 different counties, always the same shape. Always a quiet man with clean hands and a Bible and 6 names on paper that no living soul had ever answered to. The Territorial Land Commissioner arrived from Austin 9 days later than his original schedule called for, delayed by Renfro's own urgent dispatch, and by then there was little left for him to review that hadn't already been settled by a federal marshal. Renfro had gotten that confession the plain way, by laying Tom's ledger side by side with the county's own filing records in front of Pemberton, and letting the man do the arithmetic himself, and Pemberton, ever the reasonable sort, even at the end, had understood quickly enough that a trial before an unfriendly judge in Austin would go a great deal worse for him than a full accounting given now to a marshal he might still hope to negotiate a lighter sentence from. Cyrus Boyle, the young rider sent home that night with his dignity mostly intact, gave a full and honest account that did more damage to Pemberton's story than any ledger ever could have on its own, because a frightened young man telling the plain truth, no matter how well it's dressed. Pemberton's land patents were voided inside the month. The phantom claims reverted to open filing, and 3 small ranching families who'd been squeezed hard for 2 years under Pemberton's paper empire filed honest claims of their own on land that had never truly belonged to anyone. Wade Colfax was never seen again in Comfort County, though word drifted back eventually from somewhere near El Paso that a man of his description had taken up honest ranch work under a different name entirely. Silas, hearing that, allowed it might even be true. A man could change, he'd say, dry as dust. He was living proof of it himself, though he'd always add that it generally took more than one bad Sunday to manage the trick. Silas stayed on at the Whitlock place through the rest of that summer, mending fences that didn't strictly need mending, and something quiet and companionable grew between him and Della in those slow weeks that neither one would ever have called a romance, and it didn't need to become one to matter a great deal regardless. It was closer to the peace of 2 people who had each carried a debt alone for a long time, and had finally set part of it down together, in the same kitchen, at the same table. In the last week of August, she wondered aloud whether he meant to keep riding. Once the harvest was in territories got no more use for the undertaker. Never did, if he was honest about it. But there might be use out here for a man who's good with a fence line and doesn't talk too much at supper. A bunkhouse stood empty, she reminded him. Since Tom never got around to hiring anybody to fill it, he'd noticed that. Fine bunkhouse, roof doesn't leak. He left anyway, on the first cool morning of September, before full light, the way men like him generally do, quiet enough not to wake anyone who wasn't already sleeping light. Della came out onto the porch in her coat to find him checking the cinch on the gray horse for the 3rd unnecessary time. You could stay, plainly no pressure behind it at all. He could, he agreed. Reckon he might come back this way. Come spring, see how that fence was holding up. That wasn't the same as staying, she pointed out. No, it wasn't, he admitted. But it was honest, and he'd promised himself a long time back he'd only ever offer what was honest from here on out. He swung up into the saddle. Tom's debt was paid, Della. Whatever was left after that, if there was anything worth having left at all, wasn't a debt anymore. That was just a choice, and choices, in his experience, went better slow. She watched him ride south until the gray horse and the gray man became one shape, and then no shape at all against the pale hill country dawn, and stood a long while after, with her hand on the porch rail, not sad exactly, something steadier than sad, before she went inside, hard-won business of a life that finally, fully belonged to her. Odessa Pratt came to visit most Sundays after that, no longer out of duty or worry, but out of the plain, comfortable habit 2 women build between them once the worst of a season has passed, and she liked to say, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has been proven right about something, that she'd known the moment she met Silas Whitlock that he was carrying more weight than a fence-mending drifter had any business carrying, and that she'd kept her suspicions to herself only because a woman who has buried 2 husbands learns not to ask a man questions he isn't ready to answer. Cyrus Boyle, for his part, took work the following spring on a small honest outfit 2 counties over, having sworn off the Hollis crew and everything it stood for, and word reached Della, years later, that the boy had made foreman by his late 20s, and never once in all that time hired a man he didn't trust with his own back turned. Small mercies, Della thought when she heard it, but real ones, the kind that don't make it into any ledger and matter anyway. Now, friends, I've sat by a great many fires, telling a great many stories, and the ones that stay with an old man aren't always the ones with the loudest gunfire in them. This one stays with me on account of a boy named Cyrus Boyle, who rode for wicked men because nobody had ever shown him another way to eat, and who, when the moment finally came, chose the plain truth over his wages, a choice that cost him a job and got him nothing back in return but the quiet, done-paid satisfaction of having done right when it would have been easier not to. The real darkness in any county was never the man with a gun in his hand at midnight. It was 6 respectable phantom names sitting quiet in a county ledger for 2 solid years, while everybody with the sense to notice looked the other way and called it somebody else's business to worry over. Silas Whitlock understood that better than most men ever get the chance to, because he'd spent a dozen years being exactly the gun a dishonest man hired so he'd never have to dirty his own hands, and it took a widow's steady aim and a dead brother's careful bookkeeping, of all things, to finally show him the difference between being feared and being needed. You can bury a name, you can bury a pair of pistols under a cottonwood tree, and walk 12 years in the opposite direction as fast as your legs will carry you. But a debt owed to the truth doesn't rot the way a man's guilt over it does. It just waits, patient as good limestone, for somebody honest enough to come along and dig it back up. Keep your powder dry, friends, and your ledger honest, until our trails cross again.